Good morning, Mr. Robinson.
Good morning, Mr. Smith.
What is our topic for today's podcast?
We have a question that I think is a great one for the youth, and it's not an uncommon question, which is, why am I not allowed to date good people in the world?
Ooh, that is a great question. Let's talk about that. Thank you again, Jake and Julia, coming by every single time we do this podcast to perform that for us. Not really, it's just a recording. But thank you very much, and I am excited about this topic. I think it's a good one. Appreciate that it was asked, and this is a topic actually has come from a young individual. And Mr. Robinson, please do me the favor of repeating today's question.
Why am I not allowed to date good people in the world?
Good repeating.
And by
Mr.
the way,
Robinson.
that's verbatim. Like you and I did not reword the question.
Oh, right, exactly.
So we're both kind of intrigued a little bit by the not allowed kind of command aspect of it.
Yeah, let's jump on that first and kind of get that out of the way, because there definitely are biblical principles in addressing this question. And that's what we're all about here on the podcast, is trying to model how to think about life, news, current events, culture, and how to think about it biblically. But in terms of not allowed, first let us highlight, hopefully you're talking to your parents. If you're a young individual and this is a rule that your parents have in place, you need to talk with them about that. Let them explain, right? If it hasn't made sense to you, have them explain some more. Hopefully what we'll say in the podcast will actually give some context for that, because it is vital, as we will discuss, that you really do want, if you're going to go on dates, you want to go on dates with individuals in the church of the same spiritual mindset. But definitely, this podcast is not a substitute for parents. You need to make sure you talk with your parents. Also, I like to emphasize this, and Ms. Robinson and I were just talking about this before the podcast. This podcast should not be considered a substitute for talking to your local ministry and actually having a relationship with your local minister. In fact, let's hear from Disclaimer Guy on that very point.
Listening to the faceless voices of two ministers on a podcast is no substitute for a friendly relationship with your local ministry. It is, however, a good substitute for 87% of modern popular music.
Thank you, Disclaimer Guy. He is right, by the way, about popular music.
You know, every generation thinks the next generation's music is terrible, but I'm going to tell you right now, starting around, I don't know, 2010, it really dropped off. It's so interesting. We can get so waylaid here. The electronification of music has made it too precise and too simple, and it's there's no heart and soul to it anymore. And you know, my girls will tell you, I'm so tired of the what's it called where they do the voice?
The not modulation. They put it through so it hits the pitch, right? It hits the different pitch notes.
I know what auto-tune.
Auto-tune, thank you.
The auto-tune. And people who, I tend to prefer the female vocalists, but who have beautiful voices, because you hear them on other songs and they auto-tune their voice. I'm like, why?
Yeah.
What are we doing here?
Yes. we're really turning left on
Yes.
But you know what? Write this down, Mr. Robinson. I think this should be an entire podcast topic. I think talking about music would
The auto-tune podcast in modern music.
But our focus today concerns dating, and why is it the question? Why can't I date good people? I think that's an important qualifier that was placed in the question. Good people in the world, and in the world means not a part of the church, not attending here at the church.
So we're going to assume, for the sake of our audience, that we all agree that you shouldn't be allowed to date bad people in the world. Like that's pretty straightforward.
Yeah, hopefully that, if the question had been, why can't I date bad people, ex-cons, and, criminals, that would have been a very different podcast.
Very short podcast. I don't know, maybe that
well, I say,
maybe not.
ex-cons.
Well, I don't know about you, Mr. Smith. I suspect you have. I've fielded this question before, and I had a young man ask me, and I think I've been asked this question a couple times, actually. Very sincere. It's an understandable question, in my opinion. Hey, what's wrong with dating some people out in the world? There's some nice people out there in the world, and that, you get it. You're like, yeah, I mean, would it be the end of the world if you had coffee with some person or maybe you went out and did a thing together?
Oh, and I should add, by dating, we do mean just going out on an event.
Right.
I've heard that
So the
dating means
traditional
different
dating.
things, like, oh, now we're dating, and what they really mean is they're shacking up or they're living together. No, we're really just talking about literally, hey, going to see a movie, though that can be fraught with danger, or going to get a coffee, or going to Chick-fil-A. So we are talking about a good traditional kind of date. And so yeah, it is a common question, right?
Yeah, it's not uncommon. I understand why younger people, especially if perhaps maybe you're in an area where it doesn't seem like there's a lot of hope. There's not a lot of. I think from the boys' perspective, you don't see a lot of girls. Who am I going to marry in the church?
Yeah, and I would think from the girls, when they don't see a lot of guys, it's traditional. The guys are asking girls out for dates, and when they don't see some around, really easily, it's not the feast or something. But yeah, I see that position too.
So is it that terrible if you went on a date or two with somebody in the world that maybe you work with or you had a rapport with and you like them and like can't we spend some time together? But I'm reminded of a saying. I don't know if this is my saying or I heard it somewhere, but we tend to marry the people we date. I think that the number of marriages that have occurred where there was no dating beforehand is probably close to zero. I know there's some reality TV show on right now, again, that's like you're supposed to talk to the person but you don't see him, and then you have to decide if you're going to marry him.
Oh, really?
I think it's a Netflix show.
That sounds Netflixy.
Anyway, we're off the course there, and so the first thing, as you and I talked about in the show prep, the first thing you should understand is dating often leads to other things.
It does. Many other things, especially from a worldly perspective. Not growing up in the church, growing up in the world, I understood that there were certain things attached to that from a worldly perspective. But in terms of marriage, it's very easy to just say, look, I'm not talking about trying to marry someone. I'm just talking about a date. But exactly like you said, Mr. Robinson, marriage is not only a side effect of dating, it's part of the purpose. It's part of the overall goal is that eventually you will go on a date with that person you will marry. You don't know who that is ahead of time. That's part of why you're dating, is you're learning and you're serving other people in dating. And the idea that, whoever it is you eventually marry, think about it. That is going to be someone you went on a date with, right? That the pool of people, all the humans on the planet, reduce that down to the pool of people that you go on a date with, and in there is going to be the person you're going to marry. It is inseparable. Now, that said, we do try to teach at camp that concepts like, asking someone for a dance is not like a proposal. You're literally just serving the other person and enjoying a dance together. You're not marrying a person. Same thing with going out on a date. If a guy in a congregation asks a young woman in a congregation, or maybe a visiting from another congregation, hey, would you like to go to, it doesn't have to be Starbucks. I tend to do the lazy coffee route. When we meet for Starbucks tomorrow, you mentioned something about the Star Wars sequel movies, and I want to keep talking about that or something. You ask someone on a date. What was my point about this, Rob? Why did I even bring this up? Sorry. That's not, you're not proposing marriage. You're not saying, hey, let's go out for Starbucks. And by the way, I think you should be the mother of my children. We're trying to remove the burden of that so that it really is just a social occasion. But at the same time, there's a vulnerability there in terms of, being on a date. I've known many tales. We bring up Mr. Sandor a lot because we talk with him a lot. When he and his wife met, I'll tell a brief element of their story. Man, she was not impressed with him at all. She did not think, she just did not like Mr. Sandor, just so you know. However, look at them now. They're married and they have kids and they're this amazing family. So, you can't completely predict those things. And so, yes, the idea of who you should marry should be a fundamental part of who you're willing to date. I tend to say you should not date those individuals you should not marry, and you cannot date those whom you cannot marry. You should set boundaries there in that regard. Proverbs chapter 4 and verse 23 to me informs this. It's actually one of my son's favorite verses. I think it's Michael's. In the New King James, Proverbs 4:23 says, keep your heart. It means kind of protect it, see to it. Keep your heart with all diligence, for out of it spring the issues of life. Your heart is worth protecting in that regard, because really so much of your entire life just flows out of it. And so you have a responsibility to yourself and to those whom your future will touch to protect that heart. And so, yes, it is just a Starbucks date. And yet at the same time, how many marriages began unexpectedly from that first Starbucks date? So yes, there is a connection between dating and marriage. It cannot be denied.
Exactly. So let's extrapolate a little. So let's say that you started dating this person, and then guess what? You really like them, so you date some more, and then you're not careful to guard your heart. Is the way the Proverbs
Talk about.
exhort us, and you get married to this person. Okay, let's just get real. You're now married to somebody not in the church. Okay, quickly the pros and largely the cons emerge.
And I should, before you go, this would be a perfect time. You've set me up. I want to make sure I don't miss it. That we are talking about a literal command to marry someone in the faith. This is not just a preference. Again, another verse, 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 39, because I know the pros and cons that Ms. Robbins is going to go to, and let's just start with this con to get it out of the way, because sometimes think, oh, it's just a preference. It's just something unwise. No, it's literally a command. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 39, the Apostle Paul is talking to women whose husbands have died, trying to make plain to them that they are free to remarry, that marriage really does end at death. And in Proverbs chapter 7 verse 39, he says, "A wife is bound by law as long as her husband lives. But if her husband dies, she is at liberty to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord." That is the fundamental expectation. We see it reflected in the Old Testament, which Ms. Robinson might have some additional things to add, where God wanted Israel and commanded them. They need to marry inside the congregation of Israel. God is doing something in the body. And for us as Christians, we are commanded. We must seek to marry in the Lord. We must marry those of the same faith. But even just beyond that command, you just think about the pros and cons, and it just makes it that much more obvious.
Well, when you read through Joshua and Judges, which is Joshua is the story of the nation of Israel going in and taking the promised land, and God had made it crystal clear that they were supposed to remove all the nations in their entirety, which they did not do. And so Judges really brings out more of the consequences of it. In fact, the first 3 or 4 chapters of it just make it clear over and over and over again how they would do okay for a little while, and then a generation would arise that didn't witness certain events, and they were worse. They were worse than the generation before them, and they started intermarrying with the nations around them. The most critical factor of all that is God lays great emphasis in the Bible on the fact that God revealed his laws and his commandments and his statutes and his judgments to his chosen people so they would know the right mode of living, that they would have the most successful outcome. They would live the happiest, most fulfilling lives. And the nations around them didn't have any of that and were not living lives like that. They had their own ideas, they had their own traditions, they have their own religious rites. And as soon as you marry somebody like that outside your belief system, immediately they're going to influence you. I'd like to refer back to the golden era of talk radio, which was the 90s. You had a...
Was it really?
I think that was when it was.
I can see that. I could see that.
There was an on-air personality by the name of Dr. Laura Schlesinger. And I know some people will have heard of her, but a lot have not. And
Mr. Weston's mentioned her, I think, in a sermon or two.
She was not perfect, but she did base a lot of her wisdom biblically. But anytime somebody would call up the show and ask for advice, and let's just use the most extreme example to make the point, somebody Jewish is marrying somebody Catholic. Okay.
Yeah, for some reason you hear about that a lot, right?
And so anyway, a mix of religious beliefs. She always referred to those as an interfaithless marriage. Okay.
Because they call them interfaith marriages.
That's right.
And she twisted that. Very nice.
Interfaithless
marriage? Right. Okay.
Interfaith means relating to or between different religions or members of a different religion. So she liked the pun. But her answer was essentially, that's not a great idea. And we're not even talking about the truth that's been revealed in God's church, which is, you emphasize all the time the distinctives. We have a lot of distinctives.
Right.
If you were a Baptist marrying a Protestant, a Lutheran or something, you'd at least have a shot of having some commonality compared to what you have in the Church of God.
Right.
But she liked to play on it, interfaithless. It's like basically neither one of us seems to be too committed to our beliefs. And the way she made her point, which I thought was a very good one, is what happens when the kids grow up? Are we keeping Christmas or are we keeping Hanukkah? and
Right.
it will be a battle your entire marriage.
Right. If it matters to you. And I think that's important because that's what she's saying. Interfaithless. Either something has to give. And what tends to give is your commitment to your faith because you have to make room for the other. That tends to be where it does really become not a stronger faith marriage, but it becomes a faithless. You have to dilute things. In Israel's, it's not like somehow in Israel's mixing with other peoples of other faiths, Israel's faith was made stronger in the Old Testament. They weren't. Well, now we're super committed to the laws and ways of God. No, you look at Nehemiah's time. He's saying like, man, some of these people don't even know. When he said they aren't like speaking Hebrew and such, that was the language of Scripture, right? I mean, they were. It's like creating a completely different culture. It's diluting what God has placed in the faith, not actually making it stronger in any kind of way.
It was interesting when I studied this a few months ago. There really is this pattern. It's recorded very well throughout the Old Testament. God works dramatically, has a great leader. The nation witnesses these things, and then what happens is over time that generation dies out and the younger generation comes along, and they didn't see those dramatic things and didn't witness them and didn't treasure the teaching that they had been given and didn't appreciate it in a way that they should, and just each generation tended to be progressively worse to where they had fallen into idolatry. And a huge part of it, I'm just telling you, read Judges over and over. A big reason was intermarrying within the nations around them, which was again heavily cultural and religious, and the differences, and that's why there was the problem. I want to come back to one other thing, though, Mr. Smith, that's related to our introduction, and that is, and I think you should expound upon it because you had an even stronger feeling about it than I did.
Okay.
What happens if you grow up in the church and you receive these teachings and you see the truth of it, and there's all this hope within you and this idea that you could be a reborn son or daughter of God in spirit life, and you marry somebody who doesn't share that hope with you?
Oh, wow. Okay. Thank you for bringing that up because I do feel really strongly about that. There's a passage, I was able to find it, that when I read this passage, and I wish I could remember who it was who put it this way, but ever since they did, it's meant something particular for me. In Colossians, chapter 3 and verses 2 and 3, Paul is speaking to those in Colossae, and he tells them in verse 2 to set your mind on things above, not on things on the earth. But then he says in verse 3, for you died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. And then he highlights in verse 4, when Christ, who is our life, appears, Christ, who is our life, appears, then you also will appear with him in glory. But that verse 3, where he says, you died and your life is hidden with Christ in God. When you really do embrace this way of life, God's own calling, his working with you, it is like your life is bound up with Christ and it's hidden in God. If someone wants to understand you, they truly cannot fully understand you without coming to understand as well the things of God. It's as if they have to look through God to be able to see you because your life is hidden with that. His love, his spirit, his laws, his way of life, his Son who is living in you, that redefines your whole life. And it's the most important things in your life. Your future with him is the most important thing in your life. Your devotion to him is the most important thing in your life. Well, if marriage is about two becoming one, why in the world would I want to marry someone with whom I cannot share the single most important things in my life? It's as if agreeing from the outset that the core of my very being is something I will never be able to share with this other person because they are not of the faith that I am. And God isn't opening their mind. He's not working with them in the same way. It's one thing to enter into the faith, as some have. They're older people. They were already married in the world, and God calls one and not the other. But if we have the blessed opportunity to seek to begin those relationships on the right foot, where we truly can become one, why would we not want to do that? We should want to do that. But if we don't think it's that important, if we don't think that a person we might want to marry share the very core beliefs that define our whole life and orient our entire worldview, if we don't think that it's that important that they share that, then either one, we do not understand what marriage means, or two, apparently that is actually not as important to us as it comes across. And that's part of why it's important, again, the connection we made at the beginning, dating leads to marriage, because once those emotions begin to be involved, you start not evaluating things the same way. Suddenly you don't start evaluating marriage for the important thing that it is. You just start, it's just something you kind of want. Or you don't really evaluate accurately these core elements of who you are. You start to downgrade them a bit, and then you find yourself in a marriage where, frankly, you do face some pain. You face pain in not being able to share those things. You face pain in terms of not having someone who can relate to you in the things that you think are absolutely most important. So, yeah, is that what you were referring to,
yes,
Mr. Robinson?
Exactly. And think about, let's say you even have your best case scenario, which the person is in no way hostile to your beliefs.
Yeah, best case in quote. In this scenario where it is a spouse outside of the church, right?
Outside the church. They're even supportive. Maybe they go to the feast with you, but maybe they don't. And think about the sadness every year when you pack up to head out for the feast and your spouse is not going with you, or they're going and it's just a vacation to them. And you come out of services and you're excited about the message you heard and the hope that, because the feast focuses so much on millennial ideas, they don't understand it. Can't share it with them. It's like the most fundamental aspect of your being in some ways is this hope that lies within you, ideally. And you can't share it with the person that you're most bonded with.
Right. And I have heard individuals who say, and I can understand where they're coming from. They'll say, this is not me, as you'll hear when I say this, because I don't, as Tyler Wayne said once, I don't sports much. I think that's the way you put it. I'm not sportsy. But I have known people who are sportsy. Mr. Robinson, you're fairly sportsy, I think, to a certain extent.
Less so these days.
The years take their toll. But someone who says, man, I just love sports, and I just, boy, when I find a mate, I want to make sure it's someone who understands that. And so they're a part of that life with me, and maybe we go to games together or whatever, and they think of these things that are really important to them. Man, I'm an outdoors guy or an outdoors girl, and I want to marry someone that's an outdoors person like I am. And I get that. You might be surprised the outdoors person suddenly stumbles upon the nerd, or whatever. But regardless, I totally get that. But it's just irrational to say that you've got things that are very important to you in a mate, and you've got that list of things, and somehow your faith in terms of the way you understand reality and relate to your creator is not there on the top of the list. Why would you put, I want to make sure I marry a Dallas Cowboys fan like I am, above somehow, I want to make sure I marry someone who actually has a relationship with the living God? Because, even in just terms of the practical nature of marriage, the fact is the husband needs to be a spiritual leader. How can a husband be a spiritual leader if he's not of the faith? Yep. And if it's the woman who's of the faith, or vice versa, if the husband who's of the faith, the woman is not, how can he lead someone who spiritually is not committed to the same things? There's those practical natures. There's the fact that a real relationship takes a lot of work. And it does go through hard times. Why would I want to be in it with someone who isn't tapping into the same divine strength I'm tapping into? I got to be honest. My wife needs divine strength to deal with me sometimes, Mr. Robinson, and it encourages me to know that she has that there, and surely vice versa. So yes, the command is to marry in the faith. But there's just so many reasons why it's not just an obligation that we do begrudgingly, but when you really understand it, that's exactly what you want. You want to marry in the faith.
Plus, there's another aspect of this. So we've outlined your best case scenario in this scenario. Can I say that?
Yeah, you can say that.
Okay, and that is, I know of a number of people that have had an unconverted spouse, and they stick to it. Like they make it work. They do a lot of effort, and they've made it work, and they stay true to the faith. But I would argue that I know of more where that's not the case. And you think of the example of Solomon and his amazing kingdom, and everybody was happy living in it. But what does it say about him towards the end of his life? He married so many women that were not from the nation of Israel, and I think it's Chronicles records that they when later in his life turned his heart away from the Lord to follow idols.
Right.
That is your worst case scenario. I have underestimated how much my wife influences me and has over the last 25 years.
Yes.
And I've come to realize, no, I would absolutely be susceptible to that. If I had a wife, or especially wives, who were trying to introduce me to other ideas and why can't, what's wrong with wearing green today on St. Patrick's Day? Guys, not like you're worshiping St. Patrick. Well, no, but we've taken our first step. And so your worst case scenario is, you're influenced by the person you're married, and they actually, over time, you let down, and you're not where you need to be, and you're just spiritually vulnerable, and maybe you don't end up sticking with your faith.
Right. I gave a sermon about marriage fairly recently here in Charlotte, trying to encourage people that marriage is it's a wonderful thing. Go out there and pursue it. It's a worthwhile thing to pursue. And in that, I tried to highlight the fact that, when you marry someone, that person is a remarkable influence on you. I'm not sure actually that I said so much this in the sermon. I do know I say it in pre-engagement and premarital counseling, which is the person you marry will be. It's virtually impossible to avoid this. That person you marry will be one of the single most significant spiritual influences in your life, whether you're a man or you're a woman. Why? They're with you 24/7. Part of your life is wrapped around trying to shape a life with them together. I could go on and on about my wife, but my wife is an incredibly positive influence on me spiritually, for instance. I'm not saying that one of us is stronger spiritually than the other. We bring a mix of spiritual strengths. And yet at the same time, if she were not the woman of the character that she is, I can almost guarantee I would not be of whatever character I happen to have. I'm not going to degrade that, other than say it would be less if she were a person of less spiritual character. Her devotion to her God makes my devotion better. And it's not always because it's more. Sometimes it's because it's different. So there's just different elements. I can't fathom the kind of person I would be if I'd married someone not in the faith. I wouldn't want that. It'd be a struggle. It'd be a strain. And there are cases, Solomon's a good example, where it actually is too much and a person goes off the rails because the pull of that, it is intended to be a powerful human relationship in your life.
Right.
And you're essentially, if I can, kind of giving the devil permission to say, hey, use this to pull me in the wrong direction. In fact, that brings in my mind the equally yoked scripture. Did you have that on?
Yeah,
on
no,
your
I have
list?
it right here. That excellent point. 2 Corinthians 6:14. Do not be unequally yoked together with unbelievers. For what fellowship has righteousness with lawlessness, and what communion has light with darkness? There's a couple of things that jump out to me about that, and one is like the very stark contrast. Like that is, there's not some kind of middle ground, and this is something I thought about mentioning because the way the question is worded is interesting to me, which is, why am I not allowed to date good people? And I didn't know if we'd have an opportunity to address this, but it's kind of naturally fallen here to us. What are you calling good people? That's not the way the Bible looks at them. Like, look, does this person have some character attributes that you like? Maybe they're kind to strangers and poor people. They have something about them clearly that you like. There's an aspect of morality in them that is there. But when you start defining what a good person is, biblically, it's not this person you're dating in the world. I know that's harsh, but reread 2 Corinthians 6:14. It's a pretty straightforward categories.
Well, right, if you want to talk about harsh, you go to Jesus Christ when someone calls him good teacher and he says, well, why do you call me good? There's only one who's good. Now, that doesn't mean he was saying he is not good. Actually, that ties into the fact that Jesus and the Father together are God. But that said, that's still an important point. What do we mean by good? The Bible defines righteousness. The Bible defines goodness. Now, we'll add, this is something Mr. Weston used to highlight at camp. In fact, the last camp in Michigan, I remember him saying this, that even within the church, There are some people who are just filling a seat, and there's other people who are actually taking, the life of God seriously.
So you're saying marry one of them instead?
No, I am not. He would emphasize at camp, he and Mr. Manier both, really, even then when it comes to marrying, you're looking for someone who's spiritually on the same page as you are, someone who's serious like you are. And so, it really is not just about this kind of rule you're trying to satisfy and trying to ask, well, why don't good people satisfy that rule? Again, it's a matter of actually thinking, what is the whole point of all of this? Going to the principles involved. And thank you for bringing up that point about good people, because I do believe that was a key element in the question that honestly I had not thought to address. But I think hopefully we've made it plain that being a good person not in the faith, like sometimes they're a good person because they are just the nicest Catholic you're going to find, or they're a really great Baptist, and you're going to have those commonalities perhaps in terms of, we're both pro-life, we don't like abortion, we believe that God should be important. But all the more, there are these things that still they will not believe. There's literally things we believe that the most religious out there that are really good people, they think of as outright heresy, just rank anti-God heresy. And yeah, they may not think that we're a terrible person, and there's still compromise, but how? There's compromises. They damp down some of their religious sentiment, and you end up dampening down some of yours.
Right. That's a good point. Think about something that's not this. By the way, this should be mind-boggling to all of us. That's not even really controversial anymore in some ways. Like it's not even battled over politically, but the idea of homosexuality. And so, what if you're married to a spouse, and over time, they're like, what's with you and the homosexuals? It's not. What's the big deal? You're kind of a homophobe.
Wow. Yeah, because the world is constantly working on people, and so yeah, they would be subject to that.
So the society has shifted so much in our timeline.
Right.
I know you go back to talk to like people that were in the World War II generation and thought we were sliding in the wrong direction, but like we were really sliding in the wrong direction. Like so much has changed. The social battle has been lost.
Well, you actually have now. I read the other day talking about people just in terms of Republican and Democrat, and there's articles about how do I deal with my Republican family at Thanksgiving or my Democratic family at Thanksgiving? How do I deal with my pro-Trump brother or my pro-Biden, build back better, where it is dividing families, and we're only at the beginning of the kind of divisions the world is going to see. It is going to get deeper and it's going to get stronger, let alone in a circumstance like that. So, it's so funny. Mr. Robinson and I were joking earlier. It's kind of the kiss of death in one way of saying, we think this could be a short one. We think this actually might, but we've actually gone more than half an hour at this point.
Wow.
So we were actually longer than the last one.
So then, okay, if
we could
we'd
probably
done the
wrap up.
short version, it would have been. Why are you not allowed to date good people in the world? Well, because eventually you're going to marry them, and that's a bad idea.
Not everyone. You're going to marry one, but yes, that's right.
Right. It increases the probability you're going to marry them, and that's not a good idea.
Yeah, absolutely. Dating and marriage are intimately tied. Not every date leads to a marriage. It shouldn't be. That would be very strange. You should go serve other people. Guys, ask girls out in the church, ask for coffee, do those kind of things. But that said, yeah, dating and marriage is intimately connected, and you don't want to play around with those things. You want to listen to what God has to say.
Marriage, I was thinking of this when you were talking about you and Mrs. Smith. Navigating a marriage successfully is a lot of work and has many challenges.
It's worth it, but it has challenges.
Exactly. And so just imagine not actually being on the same page about some of those important components. It just magnifies the difficulties. I mean, I guess my point is, what I was trying to say is, it can be difficult enough to have a successful marriage when you believe the truth, when both of you believe the truth, let alone if you don't.
Oh, right. We've talked about, and I do want to add this to that verse, and I forgot at the time. You talk about the unequally yoked. I know there's lots of details to that one statement that can be brought in by people that are more expert perhaps in actually trying to plow a field with oxen. But in my mind, I always think if you got one ox that wants to go one direction and it's yoked to another ox that wants to go, even if it's just a slightly different direction, that's a battle. You've got one pulling the yoke one way, another pulling the yoke the other way. And can you imagine being in a relationship where you constantly have the yoke straining on the left side of your neck? What calluses that would build, what skin that would abrade. That's going to say you want to make sure you're going in the exact same direction.
Well, really, the idea there, and we're so not agricultural these days, is,
Right.
I mean, imagine the idea of actually having a proper ox in one harness and a donkey in the other.
Right.
I mean, it really is a problem. There's a mismatched strength and size, and donkeys are obstinate, where you can train an ox pretty well. And I know we're losing our audience at this point if we're dropping off, but that, like, just put the visual thing in mind. That's what's at play here, which is two very mismatched animals trying to
Right.
pull something together. You're supposed to, like, two matched oxen are very powerful and work together, and you can get a lot done. Whereas two, you're just going to be fighting. Your effort is divided against itself, and then you're just fighting, and you're making no progress.
Right. So I think we could summarize this by saying, why does God not allow that? Because God loves you. Because God loves you and he wants better for you, and that's why he doesn't allow it.
I think that's a good way to conclude.
Why don't we conclude right there?
Smith and Robinson.